Hey guys, Quiv, the Lazy Geek here, and I just woke up. It's in the morning, an imaging session just finished. I was taking more subframes from the Sunflower Galaxy. Everything was parked, the camera is cool, everything's cool, so that's good. I'm gonna see what those additional frames did for me in a few hours. But it's not what I'm here about. Today we're going to talk about exposure times, about gains, about offsets for your cameras. Because for beginners, it's actually very difficult to understand, what gain should you be using if you have a CMOS camera like this one, or what offset should I be using as well, and on top of that, what exposure time should I be using. I see so many people recommending different exposure times depending on light pollution, depending on gain, depending on my camera, depending on everything. It's super confusing. What should I do? And my answer to that is don't sweat it. Everything's going to be fine. There's no need to be frustrated. And most of the time when people give you a number of what your exposure time should be, it's actually, you can totally go beyond that and you will not have issues. So it's kind of like your freedom, and choosing the gain and choosing the exposure time is actually an additional layer of freedom that you have. Whereas, it's not a restriction. So you can, if you find that you are exposing for too long, for example, and you need your mount is very sensitive to wind and you're losing a lot of subs, then you can play with the gain to shorten that, and vice versa. Now, if you have a CCD camera, typically you don't have gain and offset to play with, but even for CCD cameras, the rules concerning like optimal exposure time, or what I prefer to call it minimum exposure time, is exactly the same. And this is what gets computed in Nina, and I know that many people get a bit surprised at the figures that Nina gives them, but we'll explain them in a moment. Now first, I'm going to explain some stuff about how the camera sensor works, how it measures brightness, how those brightness numbers are sent to the computer, and what gain really is fundamentally. Now this has been covered in a lot of detail by Dr. Robin Glover, the creator of SharpCap, in a presentation that I am linking to in the description, and if I'm not being too lazy, also somewhere around here, or maybe around here, I don't know. If I was too lazy, nothing will appear, let me know. So let's start with the basics. You have a camera, and the camera is attached to a telescope or a lens or of some kind. So you have photons coming in from your target, getting reflected, refracted, tortured, whatever, but hopefully in the end they actually make it to your sensor, which is a good thing. And your sensor is made of pixels. Good, and so those photons arrive on each individual pixels, and each pixel, its role is to convert those photons into electrons, and this is what the camera will in the end be measuring. It doesn't measure directly the photons, it measures the number of electrons that have been generated per pixel, because it's very easy to measure a voltage difference. So but that number of electrons, by the way, it's of course proportional to the number of photons that reach each pixel. So by knowing how many electrons I had per pixel, I know how bright or how dark each pixel was, and I can build an image and everything is fine. But there's one thing to know, is that your camera and your camera sensors, they're pretty dumb. They can only count to a certain number, and this is determined by the bit depth of the sensor on the camera. So if I'm using here an ASI 533 MC Pro, if I look at the ZW website for this, I can see that here I have 14-bit written as the ADC, the analog to digital converter. And what that means is that the camera can count up to 2 to the power 14, which is roughly 16,000. My ASI 1600 Cool has only 12-bit depth if I look at it on the website. Let's have a look. Yes, 12-bit, which means that it can only count to 4,000 roughly. Oof, so 2 to the power 12. That's much less good. And the worst part is that those cameras, they can count from 0 to 16,000 for this one roughly, but it cannot count in between steps. So if the value reported by a pixel should by all means be 20.7, the camera doesn't know what 20.7 is, it will say like, I'm pretty sure that's 21. So it cannot count in between those steps. And those steps, they're called typically ADU, for analog to digital units, something like that. And so it's just like the numbers that the camera can actually count with and the camera can actually use. So the ADUs for the 1600, they're 0 to roughly 4000, and the ADUs for this one, they're roughly 0 to 16,000. And that's all of the ADUs that I have available. Okay, so now we know that the camera can count electrons. It has ADUs available to actually represent that count, even though it's making some rounding going on, and that actually leads to some error in the image being captured. But okay, it's manageable. It's not the end of the world, and that is called quantization error, if that's something that you've heard before, and I hope my English there was correct. Okay, so we can ask ourselves the question like, how many electrons does it take to go from one ADU to the next? So let's say I'm currently exposing, my pixel received like 20 electrons, and how many ADUs is that? How do I convert those 20 electrons to ADU? And if those 20 electrons put me to 2 ADU, then to go to the next one, I need 10 more electrons. And to go to the next one, I need again 10 more electrons. And to go to the next one, I need 10 more electrons, assuming there's a linear response, which in theory there should be. So that's 10 electrons. That sounds quite to me it sounds like a lot. It means that before, like, okay, the camera counted 23 electrons, so but because it's only 23, it can only go to ADU 2, and it's not enough to go to ADU 3 yet. That sounds pretty pretty low to me. Can't I make it so that the camera can just like go from one ADU to another with just like 0.1 electrons? Wouldn't that be nice? And yeah, you kind of can. So you could have, a way to somehow decrease the number of electrons needed to go from one ADU to the next, and just say like, okay, we're going to have 0.1 electrons in between each ADU. And guess what? This number of electrons per ADU, that's your gain. So this is what this gain figure is doing for you. And if I go down to the charts that we have on each ZWO camera page, and I would assume on other manufacturers' page as well, I can see we have this gain in terms of electrons per ADU. This is exactly what I was talking about. The more electrons you need to go from one ADU to the next, the lower your gain is, because the less sensitive your pixel really is. The fewer electrons you need, then the more sensitive you are being. So you can see that we have a chart there that's non-linear. It looks kind of exponential, and on that chart you have a certain point, which is the point of gain 100, which for me is saying that it will be 1 electron per ADU. So I need 1 electron to go from one ADU to the next. How should I call this particular gain? Well, let's call it the unity gain, because 1 electron, unit. And that's why you have a unity gain in your camera ASCOM settings, for example. And that unity gain really doesn't mean much in and by itself, but for this particular camera, it actually has a significance, not because it's the unity gain in particular, but because it leads to a change in the way that the camera kind of computes the number of electrons that hit each pixel. And we'll look at that in a moment. We know that the gain, you can amp the gain, you can make it higher so that you can go from one ADU to the next faster. But we already know that this camera is dumb. It can only count up to 16,000, and my 1600 mm is even dumber. It can only count to 4,000. Some of the more recent cameras, like the super expensive, and I really want it, can someone send it to me, 6200 mm or 6200 MC have 16-bit. They actually can count to 65,000. Those are smart cameras. But this one can only count to 16,000. So, okay, 16,000. If it takes me 10 electrons to go from one ADU to the next, it means that the camera, each pixel, can count up to 160,000 electrons. Nice. But if my the number of electrons I need to go from one ADU to the next is 0.1, now it means that, okay, I will fill in all of my ADUs, I will go to the maximum count of ADU when I reach just 1600, so 1600 electrons. So I'm kind of lowering the number of electrons that I can measure. And that measure of the number of electrons, the maximum number of electrons that each pixel can actually count, is called the full well, or the full well depth, or the full well capacity. And you can see it on the ZWO website. It's this chart here, the full well in electrons. And as you would expect, the higher the gain becomes, the lower that full well depth is, just like we just computed. So we have like a lot of information already. So what happens when your full well is exceeded? So okay, I've put a very high gain on my camera because I want to like be super sensitive, but I only have my 16,000 levels to work with. So that means that I hit my full well very quickly. And so if my full well is hit, the pixel will just report, I'm completely bright, I cannot count any longer, I am white. I will be represented, this pixel will be represented as a white dot on the image. And that means that any electron or photon that reach that pixel later on cannot generate further electrons, so all of that additional brightness is lost, never to be recovered. And that's called clipping your highlights. You're basically losing a lot of signal. The whole image becomes white when it should not be white. You're losing information. Do not do that. Now there's another thing about the sensors, is that when you're reading the data from the sensor, so the camera after an exposure is over will ask the sensor like, hey, could you give me your electron count per pixel? That would be interesting to me. And the camera will say sure, and it will provide that. But while doing so, there's circuitry inside of the camera that introduces uncertainty about like the actual number of electrons that have been measured per pixel. So we're trying to measure very precisely the voltage difference, so the number of electrons per pixel, but the circuitry can only do like a reasonable job. It cannot do a perfect job, so it will make a little mistake here and there. And so like that means that if I measured like 10 electrons for one pixel, like maybe it was actually 9, maybe it was actually 11, it's roughly 10. And in that case, if I can go from like 9 to 11, and I'm simplifying here, but you could say that your read noise is 1 electron. For my particular camera, if we can see at the bottom, we have a read noise in root mean square, which is a way to kind of take the average. We'll see that for my gain of 100, the read noise is 1.5 electrons. So if one pixel reported like 10 electrons, it's like 10, but actually maybe it was 11.5 and maybe it was 8.5. It could have been in between. It could have been even higher or lower, but on average it would be in between those two values. Interesting. And don't forget that on top of that, depending on your gain, it needs to be set to a particular ADU value, so you might be losing more information than you think. But that read noise, it means that we saw that with the full well, there is like a top value that the camera can actually measure per pixel. The read noise introduces a bottom value that the camera can measure. The camera cannot reliably measure perfect darkness. Because if it measures perfect darkness, it tells me like, hey, I have 0 electrons. But my read noise tells me like the camera might say, hey, I have 1.5 electrons. And I'm like, are you sure? And that's kind of what's happening. So below 1.5 electrons, I can't really be sure of what the camera is really reporting. Is that really less than 1.5 electrons? So I kind of have a floor of measurement that is determined by my read noise there, by this uncertainty that is caused by the read noise. And that's why you will hear when people talk about optimal exposure times, it will be about swamping the read noise. And swamping the read noise is indeed important. You want to take exposures so that your pixels there will all be like significantly above the read noise, so that you have very little uncertainty about like whether a pixel was actually darker or brighter than it was supposed to be. So that's where this swamping the read noise comes from. And we can see that the read noise kind of decreases with the gain. Which is a very good thing, by the way, which means that the higher the gain, the shorter I can have my exposures, right? But then at the same time, the higher the gain, the less full well depth I have. And that leads us to another measure, which is the dynamic range. And the dynamic range is something that photographers are very familiar with. It's basically not the difference, but let's say it's the difference. It's a division, but whatever. Let's say it's the difference between the highest level that you can measure, so right below the full well when your pixel will saturate, and the lowest that you can measure, which is determined by your read noise. Like the difference between those two values, or if you divide the top value by the bottom value, it kind of tells you like your dynamic range, how much your sensor can actually measure in terms of like between what levels of brightness your pixel and your sensor can measure. If it goes above a certain level of brightness, we lose information, we cannot measure, the pixel is fully white. If it goes below, we cannot measure because there's uncertainty related to the read noise. And because of those two, this floor and this roof, we have a dynamic range that is defined. And we can see the dynamic range is expressed here as dr. On this chart, and we can see that it kind of, as expected, seems to be diminishing the higher the gain is, because the higher the gain is, the lower your full well is. But we can see that for my particular camera here, and this particular camera is one example, and the 294 is similar to that, of a camera where there is a very obvious gain value that you probably want to use in 99% of the cases, and thus you don't really have to think too much about it. And for us, we can see that this camera has this big jump in read noise, or actually like a jump down in read noise at unity gain, so at gain 100. And the dynamic range at the same time increases a lot at that time, and that's because we know that we get less full well depth, because if we have unity gain, we know that there's 1 electron per ADU, which means I know that I have roughly 16,000 ADU, so I would expect my full well to be 16,000. 1 electron per ADU, 16,000 ADU, we're there. So we're lowering the full well depth, but at the same time, we're decreasing very significantly, you can see here, the read noise. So thanks to that huge decrease in read noise when we reach that particular gain, we are recovering a lot of dynamic range. And the reason for that is that there's a switch between how the readout is done on the camera when that particular gain is achieved. And so for me, for this camera, I'll always be using gain 101. I don't put 100 because I'm paranoid and I don't trust electronics. And seriously, 100 would be super fine, but I'm just superstitious. I put it to 101 just to make sure that I am indeed taking advantage of that huge step. I don't want to be like at 100 and then realize like, oops, I've been at that super high read noise the whole time. Because as we saw, the optimal exposure time is determined mostly by your read noise and to some extent by your full well. And if your read noise, the lower the read noise, the better. And so I look at this curve here, this read noise curve, and I can see that, okay, I have very high read noise there, read noises there on the left, which is not good. I don't really want to use those gains unless I really have to. And then on the right of that curve, well, the read noise kind of diminishes, but there's very little return on investment for me because it doesn't diminish by much. So I would be increasing gain, I would be decreasing significantly my dynamic range, but to what purpose? There's not really any reason I'd like to do that. So this camera gain 100 or gain 101 is what it really wants. Now you can still play with the gain, like you put it at gain 101 and you realize that for your particular conditions, that leads you to too long exposures. It will not. If I'm here and I can take 30-second exposures, then you're probably fine as well, unless you're like in the middle of Singapore or London. But you could still lower the gain. You would sacrifice your read noise, and maybe it might not be worth it, but you could try lowering the gain, see what that gives for you. And similarly, if you think that your exposures are too long for you, you're in a super dark zone, you're like in outer space, and you have so little light pollution that you can expose forever and ever without saturating your sensor with light pollution. Then you can, increase your gain so that you can have shorter exposures. So there's still, you are still allowed to play with the gain. It's just there's a very obvious value of gain that is here. Now, let's look at the 1600. The 1600 is much more interesting in terms of those gain curves because there's no obvious answer to what gain you should be using, unlike this camera. So if I go to the 1600 webpage here, and I'll go to the charts, we don't have the jump that we saw with this camera here, and we have very kind of smooth curves. My dynamic range decreases with gain kind of smoothly. My full well also decreases smoothly with gain, which is as expected, and my read noise kind of decreases fairly smoothly as well. Now we can still see, and this is the main curve I'll be looking at, my read noise, which really determines my exposure time, it decreases quite quickly at first until gain roughly 100, and then it starts decreasing less. So I'm getting less return on investment by increasing the gain the moment that I am kind of like in this area above 100 of the curve. And so I'm kind of thinking maybe the ideal gain for me would be the thing that gives me a read noise that's roughly in between those 2 points. So I want my gain to be roughly between 100 and 150. Why not? And it so happens that for this particular camera, the unity gain is 139, which is right in that between those two measures that by looking at that curve, we can think are probably good values of gain to use. So that's why, for this particular camera, unity gain is so popular. And unity gain actually makes sense in a lot of scenarios. And but then you can start off at unity gain with your 1600, and then with your particular filter you're exposing, and maybe you're using narrowband, like I am very often in Tokyo during the summer, during nebula season. So you're exposing in narrowband. Your filters, if you're rich or you're broke after buying them, which is my case, are 3 nanometer filters. So they filter a lot of the light pollution. They only let in like a little bit of light. So my image is very dark and need to expose for very long. And my focal ratio is really bad. So I used to use an Edge HD at f7 or f10, which is much worse than this one, which is at f4. Well, I needed to expose with unity gain for something like 15 minutes, but I often got like gusts of wind that would ruin my sub, so I really wanted to have much shorter exposure time per frame, and for that I increased the gain to 200. And by increasing to 200, well, I decrease a little bit my read noise, which is good, but just a little bit. I decrease my dynamic range, which is bad. I decrease my full well depth, which is also bad. So I'm losing a lot, but I am gaining by being able to take shorter subframes. And I think it's worth the sacrifice, especially if I'm not imaging objects that have a huge difference between the darkest point and the highest point, which is often the case with nebulae. So that's what I did for narrowband. And then at some point I brought my 1600 to a Bortle 4 roughly, or Bortle 5 zone, which for me is a dark zone. Don't argue with me. Bortle 4, Bortle 5 is a dark zone. And for me, in that case, the gain, the unity gain, was giving me exposures that were really short. I was saturating the sensor very quickly, and so I decided I was trying to get the Pleiades, and those, you know how bright the stars are there, and there's a lot of dynamic range between the nebulosity and the actual core of the stars. So I found that I had to reduce my gain to recover some of the dynamic range and to shorten my exposure times. So gain, really, sometimes there's a good answer for gain, like this camera. Sometimes there's no good answer, but you can still make reasonable assumptions regarding gain, which is, I think, a very good thing. Now, we've talked about gain. I haven't mentioned the offset yet, and the offset is basically kind of a value that is added to all of the results that your camera pixels reported in terms of electrons. You add a value, and the reason you want to do that, as far as I'm understanding, this is something I'm not completely sure about, so take this with a grain of salt and correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, is that you want to avoid completely black pixels. And the reason for that, I think, is that if you have completely dark pixels, they basically act as cold pixels. They can cause walking noise, they can cause image deterioration, and from my experience, completely dark pixels are very difficult to do noise reduction upon. So you try to avoid that, and so you add a certain floor value to the camera reported values. And my understanding is that adding that value hurts your dynamic range a little tiny bit. And you could add a smaller value depending on your gain, or a higher value depending again on your gain. But there's too much risk in doing so. So originally, ZW in their drivers, they had different offset values depending on your gain. But they actually changed that, I think a couple of years back, to have the same offset value for all the gains, to kind of have an offset value that's sufficiently high that they will never have problems in any gain possible. So, but there's a very easy way to actually get to that gain and to know what it is. So let's do that together. Wow, you can see that I still have my imaging session results here. It just finished. Looks like I got decent results. I think it was getting a bit cloudy at the end, so I'll probably have to throw away love subs like those that have very few stars in them. I'm also seeing that my HFR is not really changing throughout the night, which really surprises me, because this tube should be very sensitive to temperature changes. So maybe I should be, focusing less often, actually. Interesting. Anyway, that's off topic. I was saying that you can look at your camera information to actually get the offset value that ZW uses. I do not know about QHY or other manufacturers. Maybe they do the same thing. So you need to check what it is for you. So for me, I will connect to my ZWO camera, or actually not even connect to it, but I will just select the ASCOM driver, and you can do that in any piece of software you like. It could be Nina, SGP, APT, Voyager, SharpCap, FireCapture, for all I know. And then you select the ASCOM driver, and you go to the settings of that ASCOM driver, and here you select the right camera, which is for me the 533 MC Pro, and you're going to select any of the presets like Unity Gain, and once you've selected, you click on Advanced, and you look at what the offset value is. The offset value is 70. I will use 70. End of story. Wasn't that easy? So offset is something that, yes, can be optimized, but there's not really much gain in actually optimizing that offset. So, use whatever value ZW deemed was good, and that will give you probably a good offset. And so now we've talked about gain, we've talked about offsets, we've talked about read noise, we know what everything means, so we'll be able to talk more about the optimal exposure time. So this video has gone on long enough, so I'll be detailing that in the following video along with the optimal time exposure time calculator in Nina. But I still want to say something about that. The optimal exposure time is basically designed so that you're swamping the read noise. You're swamping it enough that the read noise is no longer being an obstacle. But the only thing it's saying is that you've swamped the read noise enough. It doesn't tell you that you're not allowed to expose for longer. You are, and you have no drawbacks to doing so. In fact, you will be swamping the read noise even more. But the benefits of doing so are now marginal. You're not, gaining too much anymore by exposing more, but you're not losing much anymore either, as long as you stay, to the left of the histogram, and I'll explain that in the next video. You can expose longer, or you can even expose much longer than the optimal exposure time. And for me here in Tokyo, I expose roughly 10 times longer than my optimal exposure time, and I have no issues. And I find that there's a lot of frustration going on about like, okay, what should be my optimal exposure time? Why aren't you imaging at optimal exposure time? Have you looked at your optimal exposure time? When really it's very fine to play it by ear, as long as you're not saturating pixels on your camera, which you should not be if you stay on the left third of the histogram, more or less. You'll be fine. It's not a big deal. And it's like I think people get stuck on it a bit too much, especially beginners, because they don't really know what to do. And I tend to be more relaxed about it. I want to have this as a hobby. I don't want it to be frustrating. Yes, I want to optimize things, but if I'm going to hit my head against the wall and take millions of frames because I have to use like 1 second exposures, and then I'll be spending like 20 hours on my computer to stack them, it's just no longer worth it, and it doesn't make the hobby enjoyable anymore. So again, optimal exposure time, I think of it as minimum exposure time. And I can totally, and I don't think I've ever exposed at the optimal exposure time. I always go higher, and if you're careful, there's no drawback in doing so. So I'll cover that in the next video. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. So click that subscribe. Also, if you think this video was useful, please click the like button. If you did not like it, you are free to click the dislike button. I would appreciate if you leave a comment explaining why you did so and how you could do to improve. And thank you so much for watching, and never forget to look up at the stars. See you next time.